Hi, this is Keith Ward with Visual Studio Magazine, and joining me right now is Billy Hollis. Billy, tell us what you're doing here this week, what sessions you're presenting, and what your specialty is in the development realm.
Well, in development, I typically spend most of my time on things that have to do with the front end, user experience, user interface design. I do have a team that does end-to-end development for consulting, particularly healthcare apps, but I personally tend to spend quite a bit of time on the front end. So I was one of the early guys in the XAML space, did a lot of the early sort of pilot examples there that people still look to in WPF, for example. And then we've been doing some Windows 8 stuff recently. So most of the stuff I'm doing here is around Windows 8. I did a session this morning on the Windows 8 design guidelines, which like this 300-page PDF that's got design guidelines. So I tried to distill that down for the crowd. Then I have a session coming up this afternoon on the new controls and elements, more technical, code-oriented. The session this morning was more about design concept stuff, and now we're going to talk about code in the afternoon session.
Okay, great. So let me ask you, is design becoming more relevant, more important for developers in this era of smartphone apps, of tablet apps? Is it taking on an importance it maybe wouldn't have had in years past?
Well, certainly the consumerization was launched by Apple and then followed on by Android, raised a lot of user expectations. And I put it this way typically. Think about somebody who is, I don't know, 24 years old, going into the workforce, into a corporation for the first time. And their conception of what technology looks like is that their first music player was probably an iPod, and they have an iPad or an Android or a smartphone. And now sit them down in front of a typical corporate system that comes from Visual Basic, Windows Forms, primitive web, whatever. What's the emotional impact of that, the contrast of that versus what they use every day? I think that intangible impact is people go, what kind of company am I working for here? These people can't, this is awful, this is terrible stuff. I expect better. So I think that there's a pretty big impact on the generation coming into the workforce. They expect better.
Yeah. And when you shrink down the size of the screens now, iPhone, Android, Windows 8, the design in some ways it seems like becomes more important because you've got less real estate, so the placement of things would seem to be more important. Do you find that to be true?
Well, certainly you have to factor out the application down to the minimal function set a lot more aggressively. But I've always thought that was a good idea. It's just that in the past, the easy way to do it was just to keep dragging controls onto a screen until you thought you had enough, keep adding features. I've ended up with clients with 400 options on the menus, going down through main options and down through the trees. And certainly for any particular person doing any particular task, they just don't need that much. Now, it imposes a pretty high bar on the developer, not just from the technical perspective or even understanding the design concepts, but their understanding of the user's world has to be better now. One of the things I tend to use is, if you can spend 5 years honing your craft, you can spend 3 days observing users and understanding what they do. The user observation and the other things that you can do to gain a better picture for the user's daily work, that's kind of your essential raw material to going through that phase of getting an app down to the minimum that the user actually needs, and either eliminating or hiding away the stuff that isn't needed on a routine basis.
Sure. Now, there are a number of developers who will say, I'm a developer, I'm not a designer. That's a separate area. We need other people for that. What do you say? Is that developer correct or not?
Well, not every developer needs to be a designer, but every team needs to have some good, solid design capabilities. Now, the kind of design talent that you need in this era is not the graphic stuff, because we've had web designers who have been pretty good at that for a long time. What you need is interaction designers. The typical graphics design people don't do a particularly good job there. The number of people in the industry who focus on interaction design is far, far too limited to satisfy the demand for all the teams. So most teams are going to need at least some team members understand more about interaction design, how you go through the design process, what the principles are. If They don't do that. The team is going to suffer, and the app's quality is going to suffer. It doesn't mean every developer has to be a designer, but some of them need to be.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Give me a couple of the top tips, without going into detail, what you tell people who are building Windows 8 apps. What are some of the key factors that they need to take into account when they start on building it? Because you need to incorporate design early on, don't you?
Yeah. If I had to give people just a couple of basic tips, and this will seem like going back too far in the process, I think, but I think it tends to be. It tends to get people moving in the right direction. And that is two things. Number one is do your first work with pencil and paper. Do not go to those tools, those automated tools for wireframing. Why? Well, because there's something about doing it on a blank sheet of paper with a pencil that you'll let your imagination do a better job.
Okay.
And that's also a very low investment. You're not investing a lot to do it.
Right.
So you tend to be more expansive. And let's just explore this idea. Where you sit down in front of a terminal and you start dragging things around in wireframes, the investment goes up and you start to feel like, oh, okay, well, I've got to really make this work, because with paper, you do a few minutes, wad it up, throw it away, that's fine. The second thing that's related to that is almost every team, especially in the Microsoft space, that I see that does user experience design, thinks in terms of a single track. They do a prototype, and they grind away on that. They do a design, and they keep grinding on that design. Let's show that to the users and get their reaction. The best single hint I can give people is to adapt an attitude of experimentation. Let's try to do 3 or 4 competing designs and then show them all to the users. See, if you just show one design to the user, what can they say? Right. You're basically saying, you like it or don't you? And they don't want to tell you that your baby's ugly, do they? Right. So they don't really give you very good feedback on a single design.
Right.
You don't find out there's something wrong with it until you try to put it in the field, because they're not thinking very hard about it. But if you put several designs in front of them, several competing designs, now you've engaged their thought processes about their workflow at a much higher level as they try to match it to these different ways of approaching it. And now they're giving you much, much better feedback, and your probability of getting a design that really increases productivity and is compelling is much, much higher.
Well, Billy Hollis, thank you very much for joining us today.
Welcome.
It was a pleasure to talk to you.
I enjoyed it.